Hey guys, thank you for joining me. This is the oldest playbook. Today, for the first time, we're streaming not just on LinkedIn, but also on YouTube, so we'll see how this goes. Guys, we had two different series. The first series, 6 week series, was on the guy named King David. Because my name's David, it was very appropriate to start with King David. Second series, another 6 week series, was on Moses. And I'm surprised how well that went. Because I've always known the story of Moses, but to really analyze and decode the story of Moses from the perspective of founders and operators, just very eye-opening for me as well. All right, we're going to enter series three, the third series. For the next 6 weeks, we will be again analyzing, decoding the oldest playbook, aka the Bible, from the founder, perspective of founder and builder and operator. So founder, builder, operator. The series three is going to be about diasporas, third culture founders, and operators. I myself am a third culture. A third culture means there's first culture, which you can call your motherland culture. So for me, that's Korean. And then there's the second culture, which is a culture that I'm born in. That's like my culture, not the culture of my ancestors, but the culture that I consider mine, which is American. Third culture is the third space between the two cultures, and it is my unique space and my identity. Now, third culture doesn't just apply, ladies and gentlemen, to nations or race or ethnicity. It could apply, as I say, to industry. So maybe you're in tech and art, fashion, and the two combined creates a third culture. So for the next 6 weeks, we will be analyzing some biblical characters from a who are all third culture. Okay. All right. Today we'll launch off with a gentleman. His name's Joseph. There is a moment in the story where a man is standing in a palace in Egypt. And in front of him are 10 foreigners who have come begging for food. They don't recognize him. So they start talking about him to each other in their own language right in front of him. Because they assume, reasonably, they assume that the second most powerful man in Egypt does not speak Hebrew. But he does. They're his brothers. He has been listening to every single word, and the text says it so quietly that it could be missed. It says that they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Fluent in a language he was not born into, unreadable to the people who were. If that sentence describes a room you have been in, a dinner table, a board meeting, a customs line, an entire country, then I think this story belongs to you a lot more than it belongs to most of the people who tell it. Also, at that moment in this story, this guy, his name is not Joseph, okay? Joseph had another name, and we'll get there in a bit. Let's go backwards a little bit, okay? The oldest playbook, ladies and gentlemen, once again, is us looking at the Bible and decoding it from the perspective of founder, builder, and operator. So in the story that we're covering today, Joseph is 17. Okay, that's where we begin. He's 17. And what I want to say something about Joseph, he's over romanticized, but I'm going to use one word to describe him. That one word is he's insufferable. This guy's kind of annoying, right? We've sanitized this man. We put him in musicals. We read about him. Ben Affleck plays his voice in Joseph the Dreamer. But there's more to this guy, and that more is that he is annoying and insufferable. His father Jacob has 12 sons and decides to have a favorite. And he handles this with all the subtlety of a man buying a kid a car, okay, a sports car, a red sports car. He gives Joseph a coat, okay, an ornate, expensive, absolutely not meant for manual labor coat. And Joseph wears it around his brothers, who are what? Working manual labor. And then Joseph has a dream that his entire family are bowing down to him. And he doesn't keep it to himself. Joseph tells everybody about it. And that goes poorly, right? So then he has a second dream. And this time the content is like bigger budget, right? There's a sun, a moon, and 11 stars, everybody bowing down to him. Clearly the sun represents his dad, moon his mother, 11 stars his brothers. And he tells this one too, to everybody, to his family. And you think one would have been enough, right? You'd think that somewhere in there is a learning moment for Joseph, but nope. Joseph is insufferable. He's annoying. He just keeps telling, bragging about just stories to his brothers and his father. But here's what makes this interesting, and it's the first thing most people get wrong about Joseph. The dreams were true. They were all true. The story never takes them back. 20 odd years later, they actually do bow down to him. his brother, his father. And so he was right. He was right, and it nearly kills him. Because being right is not the same thing as being ready, right? Vision without trust doesn't land as vision. It lands as contempt. And every one of you who has ever been the smartest person in a room and made absolutely sure that everyone knows about it, you know how that ends. It's not good, right? What happens to Joseph is that they throw him into a pit. They discuss killing him. They settle on what? Just selling him, human trafficking, and they think that's the merciful option. They think it's a compromise. And then he's gone. So Joseph is 17 when the story opens. He's 30 when he finally stands in front of Pharaoh. And that's 13 years. 13 years go by. What happens? Here's what he does with those 13 years. And this is the part that matters for anyone here who builds things for a living. And I think that's most of you here who are listening to this. Joseph gets sold into a house and he ends up running that house. He gets thrown into prison and he ends up running the prison. Same instinct both times, right? He kept building systems and rooms he did not own. These weren't his domain or dominion. These weren't his company, but he always kept improving it, right? And here comes the worst part. In prison, he correctly reads a fellow inmate's dream. Good news, the guy is getting released. That's how he reads and interprets the dream. And Joseph asks him for exactly one thing. He says, when you get out, remember me. The man gets out. Does the man remember Joseph? Nope, he forgets about him. And the very next line of the story, it says, after 2 whole years. 2 years, guys, 2 years. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story of Joseph, so I'm really just jumping around a little bit here. But Joseph, after he gets sold into slavery by his brothers, ends up in prison later because the household that he was serving, he gets framed by the wife of the owner of the house because the wife, has a thing for him. And Joseph refuses her advances and gets thrown into prison. And so I'm talking about the time he's in prison. After he interprets some dreams for a fellow prisoner who gets released and becomes a cupbearer for the Pharaoh, Joseph asks that man to remember him, but the man forgot about him. And 2 years passes. That's what's going on here. 2 years of having done everything right, being forgotten by the one person on earth who could have moved Joseph, who could have moved you. Imagine that. I actually think that's the verse for a lot of us here. Not the pit. The pit is dramatic. The pit makes a good story. It's the waiting room after the pit where nothing is happening. Nothing is dramatic and nobody's coming. It's just dull. The distance between deserving it and getting it, right? Deserving it and getting it. That's where almost everybody quits. That's where we all quit. So the 2 years of inaction, I think that matters a lot. Okay, but then one morning, Pharaoh has a bad dream and nobody can interpret it. And that's when the cupbearer, that fellow prisoner that was with Joseph, remembers Joseph, tells the Pharaoh about him. And so Joseph shows up in front of the Pharaoh. He shaves, he changes his clothes, and you gotta love this because even after 13 years of hell, Joseph knows, not to show up in Pharaoh like this. He decides to upgrade himself. It's the ancient Near East equivalent of buying a blazer or a suit at the lobby. That's what Joseph does, right? He shows up for another Pharaoh, and the entire assignment was interpret the dream, right? And he does. The Pharaoh describes a dream of 7 fat cows, 7 starving ones, and Joseph interprets that 7 years of what? Abundance, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph's job was that, just to interpret it, and it should have stopped there, but no, he keeps talking. Find a discerning man, put him in charge of the land. Take a fifth of the harvest every year for the 7 years of abundance. Stockpile it and save it and build it now. Start now. While everybody is so comfortable, we got to start executing this now. So he is invited before the Pharaoh to interpret a dream, but he walks out with a job description. And I can't stress this enough. It's amazing what he does. He was the only applicant because he just created the job in front of Pharaoh at the moment of interpreting the dream. So Pharaoh looks around the room and tries to find who fits this. And there's no man who can take this job but Joseph, right? Because Joseph is the one who is aware of what's going to happen. And he believes in it, obviously, because he interpreted the dream. So the man who is fit for the job is standing right here. He's the only human being who will ever fit that role. And he wrote it, right? 40 seconds ago. So he wrote the role. He wrote the job description. So he goes into a room as a prisoner and he comes out running Egypt. And on the same day, Pharaoh, what? Takes his name, gives him a different name. Because that's the deal. And nobody ever mentions this deal, right? Pharaoh gives him three things at once. And this is a detail that a lot of people miss. But if you actually turn to the oldest playbook in this story, Pharaoh doesn't give him three gifts. That's not what Joseph sees it as. And they're just transactions, right? So first off, Pharaoh gives him a new name. And I always butcher this name. I practice it all the time, but it's Zephanath Paneah. Zephanath Paneah. It gives him a new name, Zephanath Paneah. Second, gives him an Egyptian wife and an Egyptian father-in-law who is what? The priest of Heliopolis, the temple sun god, right? And that's the package, the three things. That is the cost of promotion. So every promotion comes with a renaming, right? So let me ask this. What did you agree to be called in order to be taken seriously? For those of you who are third culture diaspora, I'm sure you have this experience. Which syllable did you sand off? Which story did you stop telling at work? What's the version of your name that you gave up for that promotion? I'm gonna have to share a little story here because my last name, Y-I, is actually pronounced E. E. So it's David E. But Y-I is like Yi or Yai to most people who don't know. I remember in elementary school, middle school, high school, even into college. When people mispronounced my last name, didn't care so much about it. I just called myself, yeah, call me Mr. Yai, Mr. E, Mr. E. It doesn't matter. Why? Because it was just easier to just let it go, brush it by, and move on. I didn't bother to correct people who mispronounced my name. And that's what I gave up, right? For the convenience of just going with the flow. It's not a big price I felt that I had to pay, but it is a transaction that happens to what I would call just move on quicker and it's more convenient. I don't want to sit there fixing people. But what if we expounded on that and blew it up? It wasn't just a name. It was something more, right? Our identity or where I'm from. It took me a while to embrace my third cultureness, being both Korean and American, and calling myself Korean American. In front of Koreans, I just say I'm Korean. In front of Americans, I just say I'm American. It wasn't a comfortable thing, not because I was embarrassed or ashamed of it, but because it was just too much, right? In fact, when I was younger, it was a little embarrassing sometimes in certain contexts to fully embrace one culture over the other. Having said that, that for me is something that I had to pay to just adopt and move faster. Back to Joseph, because I think he's going through something similar. Now, he thrives. He has a signet ring, chariots. He's second in the entire chain of commands in Egypt. And he's about to keep the entire known world alive through the 7 years of abundance and famine. By every single metric, anybody in the room that sees this, they'd say, wow, Joseph won. Joseph made it. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Joseph has two sons, and here's what's interesting. What's interesting is what he names his sons. The first one he called Manasseh because he says, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. So he names his first son forgetting. That's literally what the definition of Manasseh is, forgetting. I don't know what to do with that. I honestly don't. And I don't think the story knows what to do with it either. It just reports it and moves on. Is that healing or is it amputation? What was going on in Joseph's heart and mind? Is that a man who's been set free from his past, or a man who's quietly concluded that the only way to survive here is to stop being from there? So he names his son Forgetting. He's forgetting. Because watch what happens later. The brothers show up. He clears every Egyptian out of the room so he can finally tell his brothers who he is. And then he weeps so loudly that the people outside the room hear him anyways. The whole palace hears it, right? So whatever forget means or forgetting meant, it did not mean the thing was gone. It wasn't completely forgotten from Joseph. It was there the entire time at full volume behind the door, right? Okay, and then there's his second son. Joseph had two sons. There was Manasseh, which meant forgetting, and then he calls his second son Ephraim, because he says, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And so it's not fruitful instead of afflicted. It's not fruitful after the affliction finally ended. Fruitful in the land of affliction. Fruitful in the land of it. The affliction has not been the obstacle. It was the address, right? Affliction was just where he lived. It's him. Now, obviously, imagine this happening at school. It's like, here's my son forgetting, and here's my son fruitful in the land of my affliction. These are very two bad names, right, to give your children. But if you are a child of people who arrive from another country, sometimes we adopt different names. So my name is David, and I'm proud of that name. That is my name, David. I have friends, however, who decided not to adopt an American name. They keep their mother name, right? Motherland name. And for them, I suppose the name can sound funny. There are some names that sound funny, right? And some names work more naturally, but when a name from another country is told in English and sounds funny, I imagine that's what Manasseh and Ephraim went through, right? Because Manasseh and Ephraim, although Egyptian, literally, if it meant forgetting, and the other name meant, fruitful in the land of my affliction, I'm sure it caused a little frown and a little scratching of heads. And I'm sure that's how a lot of third culture, diaspora type people feel in a foreign land, right? But even if you're not, just understand that most of us are raising both of these type of children. When you're a builder and you're a founder, there are things about forgetting and there are things about affliction that is very dear and close to us. Okay, and let me move on. And this is where the story gets usually ends with people, right? This is when they stop. Immigrant kid makes good, names his sons, whatever he names him, credits God, credits roll, and the end. That's the end of the story. But that wasn't the end of Joseph's story. There's a chapter further on that I somehow managed not to read about 30 years. Okay. The famine arrives exactly as predicted, and Joseph, who has all the grain, begins to sell it. First to people for money, and then he sells it for their livestock. And once the livestock runs out, they come back a third time. These people come and they say to him, buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be servants to the Pharaoh. And the text says Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. So Joseph single-handedly made Pharaoh the most powerful man in Egypt. And other people, what? For food? Because without food, they die, became servants forever. And he makes it permanent. A fifth of everything which he saved for 7 years was enough to basically make Pharaoh buy everything, right? And there's one group that was exempt from this. It was the priests. And that's interesting to note, right? And here's another thing that's more interesting for me. And generations later, on the first page of the next book in Genesis, there's one sentence that is very sobering. It says, now there arose a new king over Egypt, a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And within 3 verses, the king has Joseph's own descendants as what? Slaves. And then, we hear the story of Moses, right? That's what happens. Now, I want you to be honest, okay? Because this is exactly the point where I can cheat you. I can just kind of brush it by. The Bible never actually says that the new Pharaoh used Joseph's machinery to do this. Okay, that connection is just me showing you, right? The man who centralized all the power in Egypt in order to save lives is the same man whose great grandchildren were crushed by the centralized power of Egypt. So Joseph built the very thing, and he did it with good reason, that ends up what? Saving the civilization, but it also outlives him and crushes his own people. And it's one of the most contrarian things I can say to a room full of founders and builders. So let me say it plainly, okay? Everything you're building will one day be held by somebody who does not know you, especially if you're building to outlast you. Whether your company ends up IPOing or not, but generations of folks succeed you, they inherit what you built and continue to operate your business. Thing is, 3 or 4 generations later, they will not know who you are. So the question is not only, is this good? Is this a good thing, right? You're not someone who's indispensable, right? There's always going to be a new king. We don't live forever. And the question is this still good when a worse person comes over and takes over what you have? Is that a good thing? And how do you prevent that? Something that I stay up thinking about a lot lately, right? There are other alternatives to the model that seems to make headlines, right? Especially when we hear about SpaceX and Elon Musk being a trillionaire now, and suddenly everyone thinks, wow, that's how things should be done. But a recent newsletter I wrote, Dear Founders, we talked about another model, right? There are many other models, but another model to think about, guys, is instead of building a company to become a unicorn, what if you built a company so that it would last 200 plus years, right? So there are 56 companies in the entire world that are 200 plus years old, and they are all family owned to this very day. Only 56. You know what's funny? None of those 56 are in the United States, none are in China, none are in India. The unicorn status is dominated by the US. Like 300 or plus so unicorns, then China, and then India, and the rest of the world is maybe several dozen. That's it. The United States have over 380 unicorns. So if you take a look at that, the unicorn status of these top countries, but the fact that none of these countries have companies that are over 200 years old and still family owned says a lot about the priorities of business, right? People aren't building business to necessarily what outlive them and stay within their family. The average age of a business in the United States that's on the stock exchange, they say is 18 years old before, it dies. Well, maybe we need to be thinking more the way Joseph did, right? I'm going to build this so that lives me. And even if it means that someone who isn't too good takes over, at least I built something that has a chance of doing good because I know what I built is good. It will have an echo effect throughout eternity or through generations, and it will and may benefit me and my household, right? That sort of long-term thinking is so rare these days, but perhaps it was a norm once upon a time. Maybe we should go back and think about whether that's good, and maybe it is good for most businesses, right, that aren't fast tech. Anyways, I digress a little bit. Two more things, and I'll stop, okay? When his brothers finally do come, Joseph, right? Joseph's brothers finally do come in front of him. They're terrified, okay? Absolutely certain that things will end. But what? He forgives them. And listen to how he does it. He says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Both halves of that sentence stay standing. So Joseph doesn't say it was fine, all good, bros. It was secretly a blessing all along. He doesn't say any of that. He says it like it is. He says, "You meant evil. What you did was evil, but God meant it for good." So he doesn't cheapen, right, his experience, right? He doesn't just brush it. So the only thing that actually is available for you sometimes is just to say what it is, right? And the last thing he ever says, he dies at 110 years old, the second most powerful man on earth. In the country he personally saved from starvation. He dies in Egypt. He never gets to go home, his homeland. He never goes alive, right? So 300 or some odd years later, a man named Moses, who we've covered last season, and last cycle, takes him out of Egypt in a coffin, takes Joseph out in a coffin. So Joseph was fruitful. They honored him. He got renamed. He's weeping behind closed doors. This is the story of Joseph. And still facing a country he would never ever reach as cargo. Right? He'll reach it as cargo, but he'll never ever reach it until then. Right? That's the story of Joseph. He spent his whole life building something that fed a nation, and at the end of it, the only thing he asked of anybody for him was to carry his bones to his motherland. That is the story of Joseph. And that, ladies and gentlemen, might be something powerful for some of us to keep in mind. But not all of you guys here are third culture or diaspora, but it's cool to consider some of them. Did you know over 50% of unicorns in the United States were founded by immigrants? Calendly, Zoom, Google, Tesla, SpaceX. Founders of all these companies, immigrants, third culture. This isn't to say one is preferred or the other. That's not my point here. My point is, sometimes feeling out of place is a good fuel. For those of you who aren't third culture and diaspora, I want to encourage something. I always tell people it's a good thing to see different perspectives and cultures because it forces us to be more innovative and it forces us to see things from other perspectives and it widens our scope and our perspective and view of the world. And that can't be a bad thing. That's actually good. So for those of you who aren't diaspora or third culture, I hope you're not, this message wasn't for me, so ugh. No, make it about you then. Maybe you should go check out and build at another country or another place or another sector because it will broaden your scope of who you are and what the world is. Okay, guys, I hope that was helpful. That is the first concert from our third series, which is going to be about third culture founders and operators throughout the oldest playbook. I hope that was helpful. I'm going to open up the Zoom room for those of you who are able to join. Come and join me. I'll talk to you guys soon. Okay. Have a good one.